I have seen war in all of its forms. I have seen feral savages braining each other with stones, and I have monitored the death of a whole planet at the hands of a virus bomb. I have seen space marines drop to certain death and win. I have seen titans crush whole platoons underfoot. There is no more stirring sight in war than the charge of mass cavalry.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
The Death Korps of Krieg is one of the most popular and iconic regiments in the Astra Militarum. Nothing quite sells the horror and nihilism of the setting as finding out about the blasted and irradiated world of Krieg, and how, to prevent the planet from falling into rebellion, the last loyalist commander detonated its nuclear stockpile. This being Warhammer 40k, it didn't end the fighting, but merely halting it while both loyalist and rebel forces alike on Krieg regrouped. It's that bloody civil war, which the loyalists eventually won, that shaped Krieg into the place that it is today in modern 40k. One of the more unusual products of that civil war was the redevelopment and use of cavalry as a supplement to Krieger military forces. On a world where it became increasingly difficult to use, make, and deploy tanks, horses could still be of some use, especially in the rough terrain. Although I think many people would struggle to call what the Death Riders use as mounts horses, what with their incredible bulk, hairless bodies, and clawed feet. The Death Riders of Krieg are an iconic unit of 40k, and nothing quite says the grimdark future has arrived than seeing mass cavalry charges in a setting rife with guns that can easily shoot with the fury of 1,000 suns. Still, there is something unusual about the Death Riders, and it's their choice of sword. This video will therefore aim to provide a brief discussion of Death Korps cavalry swords, and why I think they're a bit unusual. This video is intended as a bit of light fun, and a brief exploration into cavalry swords. I'm not complaining that a fictional sword used by a fictional soldier is somehow not accurate enough, and therefore that it's somehow bad. With all that being said, here's what the Imperial Armor Siege of Varak's book has to say about the Death Rider of Krieg cavalry saber. The saber is a long, heavy-bladed sword used mainly for thrusting with a tip rather than slashing. The skewer-like 95cm blade is designed to resist buckling in the impact of a thrust delivered at the charge. The blade ends in a sharp spear point, and the bowl handguard gives protection to the hand. The grip's design causes the blade to naturally align with the arm when the arm is extended, in a position for a charge using the point. So we have quite a comprehensive description of the sword, along with a picture that shows at least the structure of it. From this description, however, there are some things that don't necessarily add up. It's clear that the Krieg cavalry sword is intended for use as a thrust-centric cavalry sword. 95cm is quite a large blade, and it is described in several ways as being thrust-centric, and that you're meant to use the point rather than the edge during a cavalry charge, or just in use in general. The sword that is described here just doesn't seem to match the images that we are provided of it. Of course, there are several plausible explanations, both in-universe and out, that could explain this. Firstly, 40k is a large universe, and equipment might be impossible to standardize to the extent that we think of. Maybe the prescribed sword for the Death Riders is not often available, or some regiments are equipped with other swords as a matter of logistics. The picture says that the rider is wearing the standard issue, but of course historical militaries were often plagued by gaps between what is standard issue and the reality of their actual logistics. Of course, while the makers of 40k pay attention to loads of details, they're not necessarily seeking to replicate real-world history in their models. This cavalry, and Krieg in general, are obviously inspired by various nations from World War I. So clearly the writers were inspired by historical trends in World War I cavalry. In real life, cavalry were dropped from the war relatively early on, only to make a resurgence near its end, as well as, of course, use in areas outside of the Western Front where trench warfare made their use impractical. But back to the sword. So we have a sword that is meant to be thrust-centric, intended to deliver the point during charges. Well, the sword that is depicted here has some issues with that. Well, it does have a canted grip that would help alignment with the hand, but the blade is relatively curved, which would detract from its purpose if thrusting is its primary aim. The sword also makes use of what is a 3-bar hilt for its hand protection. While not insubstantial, as hand protection, there are gaps in this coverage of the guard that would prove problematic for the user. I would hardly describe a 3-bar hilt as a bowl. Compare this sword to some of the real-world cavalry swords used in World War I, like the British model 1918, or the German 1889 pattern sword. You'll notice that their blades are completely straight, with a long spear-like point. The hand is protected, especially in the case of the 1918, by a huge bowl that provides symmetrical coverage. This is the kind of cavalry sword that was designed and optimized for thrusting with the tip or for delivering the point during cavalry charges. The general trend for swords during this era in the real world was to converge onto straight, thrust-centric swords with large hilts. Swords that became increasingly impractical for actually sparring or dealing with enemy cavalry in protracted melees. Given the description of the Death Rider's sword, and of course their actual use, protracted engagements in melee are not their purpose. It makes sense that they would be armed with a sword optimized for charges and not melee. They are designed to deliver a launch strike, as their hunting lances are tipped with explosives, blow up their enemy, and ride away, and then use their swords if they need to deliver a cavalry charge before they can replenish their lances. By contrast, the sword that is used for the Death Rider of Krieg model, at least to me, looks a lot like the French 1822 pattern light cavalry sword. This is definitely not a bad weapon by any means, but it's a sword that was designed for light cavalry. It was a sword that was designed for use by people who were meant to skirmish with the enemy. It is the kind of sword that would have seen use in cavalry duels, or cavalry melees certainly, but it's not the kind of sword that is optimized for thrusting. And it's definitely not the kind of sword that is described as being issued to the Death Riders of Krieg for their actual purpose. Of course, this being the Imperium, we can't actually rule out the possibility that it's just a clerical error from centuries ago that the Administratum hasn't yet corrected. So that's all I've wanted to say. Hopefully next time when you take a look at a Death Rider of Krieg and you see their sword, you might think a little bit about why they actually have it and what they intend to do with it.